don't adjust for the most part. You got contributions that don't adjust for the most part. So when we're in that type of situation, what we want to do is where are those benefits and those contribution streams taking us? Are we going to pay off our unfunded liability? Is our unfunded liability going to keep growing? So one of the most important results of the actual evaluation is the funding period. And that tells us where are we headed. And based on the results of the most recent actual evaluation, 29 years, if all assumptions are met, the investment returns, how long people live, how long people work, 29 years we are expected to eliminate the unfunded liability. So that's the path we're on. So when everything else is fixed, that's all we can define is where we're headed. So, and that's important, very important metric for you all as a board to say, okay, this is where we're at. So and again, you're getting this fixed contribution rate, but also what we need, another way to look at another output from the valuation is each year there's some actuarially determined contributions. Based on different goals of where you want to be at certain times, the actuary calculates a contribution rate you would need to get to meet those goals. And so there's two different, and you use those as a measuring stick. Okay, this is what we're getting right now. If we had this goal in mind, this is a contribution rate we would need, and then you can compare the two and see if you're on the right path. So one of those is in the valuation report, is out of the valuation report. It's called the statutory actually determined employer contribution. It's a mouthful. We'll call it the statutory ADEC. And that is kind of the historical actuarial soundness threshold that this board has tracked, the 30 years. Whereas the TRS, there can't have a benefit improvement or benefit enhancement if the funding period is more than 30 years. So that statutory ADEC has really been that line in the sand whether or not the funding period is less than 30 or not. So that's historical contribution rate that you can use to compare your fixed rate to. And we're able to, so we replicated the funding period and the statutory ADEC, those those measuring sticks you use to assess the health of the retirement system. And finally, last thing to talk about it for a minute is this board also has a pension funding policy that y'all have worked with your actuary and your staff to determine what you think a healthy retirement system looks like and what you think a healthy contribution rate looks like. And it's kind of a long policy, it's a well-written policy, very thorough. To boil it down, if I may, basically what the policy says is we want our unfunded liability to go down. That would be awesome. That's it, and y'all are on that path. So with that in mind, there's a new measurement. It's actually the first time it's been in the report, but there's a contribution rate in the report now that's identified as the reasonable actuarially determined contribution, or a reasonable ADC. And the way this was calculated was basically with that goal in mind. What contribution rate do we need so that next year we expect our unfunded liability to go down? And kind of the dovetail with that funding policy of wanting the unfunded liability to go down. So this new measurement called the reasonable ADC that is calculated such that the unfunded liability is expected to go down in the next year if all assumptions are met the next year. And so really the only comment we had on that, and this is very minor, but when it was calculated in the report it's 10.39%. It was a little bit more, and when I say a little bit more, 3 basis points, 0.03% more than it needed to be such that the unfunded liability is expected to go down. It could have been 10.36. Talking about very small number differences here. And so our only recommendation was for transparency and consistency, just to kind of, if it is going to be calculated to be a little bit more than the minimum it needs to be, just to be consistent with it. And the only reason that might matter is because the funding policy also goes on to say that if we're not getting a contribution rate that's expected such that our unfunded is expected to go down next year, the next legislative appropriation request, we, meaning TRS board or staff, is supposed to request an appropriation to get up to that contribution rate. And given the size of TRS, every 1 basis point of contribution rate is $6 million. So if you're asking for 3 basis points more than maybe the minimum you need to, that's $18 million more than maybe you would otherwise ask. And we know how it works. We don't necessarily expect to get exactly the appropriation request that we asked for, but that's just to be consistent with that and to be transparent about it. Anyway, and then just finally, the last slide just says we also looked at the reports, as Daniel talked about, and just had some recommendations on how to improve the communication
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Yes, Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you look, looking at slide 11 and 12, could you help me understand the difference between that 9.4 rate statutory actuarial versus the reasonable rate? What's that
I understand.
percentage point difference in those two rates?
Right, so the statutory ADC on the slide 11 of 9.4%, that is the contribution rate that would put TRS on a path to paying off the unfunded liability in 30 years. So that's what that rate is. Now, what happens if you were to get 9.4 starting today, what actually happens, your unfunded actually goes up for a few years and then starts to kind of turn, because when you fund a plan as a percentage of payroll, if you think about it, you're backloading your contributions effectively. Like if we're getting a fixed dollar amount, like a home mortgage, you would expect your outstanding balance to go down immediately because it's level dollar amortization. But when you fund a pension plan through payroll and your contributions are backloaded over a 30-year period, especially, your unfunded liability actually goes up for about 10 years and then it starts to go down. So that's why you see a situation here on the next slide, on slide 12, where if we want to get up to a contribution rate that's expected that the unfunded liability is going to go down, we're actually going to need more than the 30-year contribution rate, because the 30-year contribution rate actually assumes it results in an unfunded liability that increases. So in order to have the unfunded liability expected to go down next year, we would need 10.39% of pay. But what happens, you know, the way we're a sticky fixed rate contribution rate type plan, if the state increased our contribution rate to 10.39 and left it there, we would actually have the unfunded liability paid off. It's like 17 years or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the number was, but really fast. Now, on the flip side of that, if the state said, okay, we're going to give you your reasonable ADC every year, what actually happens in that case is our unfunded liability would stay exactly the same every year, because all we're doing is calculating what we need to pay off the interest that accrued, and then we'd actually kind of hover around and kind of tread water. So but that would mean the contribution rate is recalculated every year. Anyway, a lot of moving parts. But that was a really good question. It's just what's your goal with the contribution rate? Because we've got a fixed rate.
To follow up on that, if I heard correctly, you indicated that our own policy requires that when we submit our legislative appropriations request, that we would request funding for one of these. So is it the 10.39 or is it the 9.4 that our policy suggests that we would request from the legislature?
Your pension funding policy, it's a lot of word salad today, would point this board to request 10.39%. And it's a little more complicated than that because you're actually phasing into some higher, but yes, it's the 10.39. It's the higher contribution rate.
But that's only if we're not actuarially sound, correct?
Right.
I thought it was you request the greater of the reasonable ADC and what you're currently getting. I thought, well, I'll leave that to, folks here in the room that know it a lot better than we do, so I'll defer to Brian on that.
I don't, you're probably right. That's how we've interpreted how we would go about it, given the situation we find ourselves in here in the state.
And the evolution with the legislature pre-funding all the benefit enhancements they did the last year is a really important evolution in this whole process. Because you all probably know well, what used to happen is you would get to be actuarially sound and start to make progress, and then a 13th check or COLA would be granted without paying for it over 30 years. And so you would see that funding period deteriorate. But now with pre-funding of those benefit enhancements, which is a really great evolution by the legislature, that should help a lot of these measurements, and to maintain the actuarial soundness and to make progress going forward should help with that a lot. So hopefully a lot of these hoops and things won't be necessary when you get to that point.
So Ron, I'm trying to understand, do you say that we're not required to make this request unless we're not actuarially sound?
That's been my understanding, but we'll go back and look at how the policy is framed, and then we need to have a discussion in July about how we would.
We also had to wait until we had fully implemented all the contribution increases, And we're not there yet.
And we're not there yet. We still have one more increase with the employer rate that needs to be made, so.
I took some liberties to boil things down in the interest of being
So-
concise, but maybe.
Presumably, you factored that into these projections, though, have you not? The increase in,
Yes.
Yes, when it came to the 29-year, for instance, yes, we absolutely reflected the scheduled contributions and the scheduled projections of the benefit amounts as well. I mean, just basically all in on that calculation of the 29-year period. And we matched, we matched GRS with respect to that.
Okay, any other questions, trustees?
I think that'll be an interesting conversation in July.
See where we're at that point,
Yes.
and we'll definitely have a good conversation about it.
Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, guys.
Very good.
Next on our agenda, board members, is